Beneath the sparkling magnificence of royal courts and the solemn gaze of regal portraits lies a story far more complex than the gilded image history often paints. The Spanish Habsburgs, draped in silks and bound by legacy, shaped an empire that once ruled vast lands, commanded immense power, and dictated the fates of millions. Yet behind the throne lurked secrets, rivalries, and decisions that still ripple through time. From opulent palaces to colonial frontiers, from silent chambers of the Inquisition to the canvases of master artists, the Hapsburg legacy is a maze of glory and tragedy, brilliance and decay, and enduring mystery waiting to be unraveled. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will dive deep into the world of the Spanish Habsburgs, not just the golden tales you've heard, but the overlooked truths, the hidden voices, and the lasting shadows of a dynasty that helped shape the course of world history. The Spanish Habsburgs remain one of the most fascinating dynasties in European history, not only for the extent of their power, but also for the complexity and depth of their influence on the Spanish realm and far beyond. Emerging as a branch of the larger Hapsburg family that had deep roots in the Holy Roman Empire, the Spanish Habsburgs ruled over Spain and its vast global empire from the early part of the 16th century to the beginning of the 18th century. They oversaw a kingdom that was the first in history where the sun never set, a domain that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas, the Philippines, and numerous territories across Europe. When most people think of the Habsburgs, they envision the glittering triumphs of the so-called Golden Age of Spain. This period conjures images of wealth flowing in from the New World, flourishing arts under patrons like Philip II, and military might be expressed through feared forces like the Spanish Armada and the Tercios. Figures such as El Greco, Velázquez, Cervantes, and Lope de Vega defined the cultural renaissance under Habsburg rule, while military and religious fervor supported the spread of Catholicism as a powerful unifying and imperial force. The Spanish Habsburgs thus occupy an iconic place in collective memory as rulers of a golden age where the empire seemed invincible and destiny seemed to favor their every move. Yet this image, however resplendent, is incomplete. The grandeur often overshadows the more intimate, less celebrated narratives, those of internal decline, personal tragedies, court intrigue, and administrative challenges. It conceals the social tensions, economic strains, and the deeply personal costs of empire building borne by monarchs who were often as trapped by their legacy as they were empowered by it. To understand the Spanish Habsburgs is not merely to gaze at their golden legacy, but to look beneath the surface, to peer into the shadows cast by the brilliance of their age. This exploration of the Habsburgs invites us to question what truly defined their reign. Were they architects of a powerful and enlightened empire, or were they guardians of a decaying system held together by ceremony, bloodlines, and religious orthodoxy? In moving beyond the textbook tales of power and splendor, we aim to uncover stories that have long been muted or misunderstood. What was it like to live in a Spain ruled by the Habsburgs? How did the decisions made in the palaces of Madrid or Valladolid affect the lives of peasants, soldiers, and bureaucrats? What kinds of pressures weighed on a royal family intermarried to the point of genetic collapse? Consider the figure of Charles V, known not just as King of Spain, but as Holy Roman Emperor. His life was a web of obligations across Europe, an emperor who spoke several languages and ruled diverse peoples, yet constantly struggled to keep his dominions from splintering. Though often celebrated for his military conquests and administrative reach, Charles wrestled with chronic illness and spiritual torment. His eventual abdication and retreat to a monastery reveal a ruler worn down by the enormity of his burden, a very human moment in an otherwise imperial narrative. Then there is Philip II, whose reign epitomizes the height of Habsburg power. He was a meticulous ruler, obsessed with detail, and one who centralized the Spanish state more effectively than his father. Under him, the Spanish Inquisition reached its peak, and Madrid became the permanent capital. But Philip's piety and control also veiled a darker legacy. His armada failed, his empire faced rebellion in the Netherlands, and his own family life was marred by death and estrangement. The figure of Philip, often cast as the embodiment of Catholic majesty, also symbolizes the dangers of absolutism and the weight of dynastic expectation. As we proceed to later monarchs such as Philip III and Philip IV, we encounter a transformation of royal power. These kings increasingly delegated authority to favorites, powerful courtiers like the Duke of Lerma and the Count Duke of Olivares, who ruled in their name while further establishing corruption and inefficiency. The kings themselves often appeared disinterested or overwhelmed, figures who retreated from direct rule into spiritual inspection or personal distraction. The court became a place of lavish ceremonies and rigid protocol, while the broader empire faltered under financial mismanagement, war debts, and loss of territories. The narrative culminates in the tragic figure of Charles II, the last Hapsburg king of Spain. Born with severe physical and mental disabilities, Charles is perhaps the most poignant symbol of the dynasty's decline. A victim of generations of inbreeding, his reign was marked by factional struggle, political paralysis, and economic deterioration. He was unable to produce an heir, and his death without issue set the stage for the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape the balance of power in Europe and end Hapsburg rule in Spain altogether. Charles II's life was not merely a political footnote. It was a deeply human story of suffering, resilience, and the burdens of inheritance. Despite his health, he was reportedly kind and devout, often trying to mediate between rival factions in his court. His reign witnessed attempts at reform and reflection, even if ultimately they were too little, too late. In many ways, Charles's story is emblematic of the contradictions that define the Spanish Habsburgs. The tension between image and reality, power and vulnerability, tradition and change. To understand the Spanish Habsburgs is also to explore the lived experiences of those outside the palace walls. The empire's wealth was built on silver from the Americas, extracted at great human and environmental cost. Indigenous populations were decimated, enslaved, or displaced, and the Spanish colonial administration often struggled to maintain order in distant provinces. Meanwhile, in Castile and Aragon, taxation increased, harvests failed, and the common people bore the brunt of imperial ambition. These stories, often relegated to the margins of grand narratives, are crucial to a fuller picture of the Hapsburg legacy. The Hapsburg era also saw a vibrant intellectual and cultural life, much of it funded or inspired by the court, but also shaped by broader social and religious movements. The Counter-Reformation shaped the Spanish identity, producing both deep devotion and stifling orthodoxy. Artistic achievements flourished even as censorship grew harsher. Writers and painters navigated a delicate balance between expressing human truth and adhering to official doctrine. The paintings of Velázquez, for instance, often appear to glorify the royal family while subtly questioning their authority through psychological depth and composition. Religious mysticism also played a significant role during this time. Figures like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross emerged not just as saints, but as voices of personal spiritual experience in an age of political and religious control. Their writings reveal a different kind of empire, not one of swords and ships, but one of the soul. These spiritual currents shaped everyday life for Spaniards and provided a counterpoint to the material ambitions of the monarchy. Women of the Habsburg court, too, played crucial roles, though often in constrained circumstances. Queens such as Isabella of Portugal and Mariana of Austria were not merely consorts, but political actors in their own right. They navigated complex court politics, advised their husbands or sons, and served as regents during times of crisis. Their correspondence, patronage, and presence in diplomatic affairs reflect the nuanced roles women could play even in a patriarchal society obsessed with bloodlines and legitimacy. Furthermore, the Habsburg obsession with purity of blood had profound implications. Their practice of intermarrying within the family to preserve dynastic power led not only to Charles II's tragic condition, but also to a narrowing of political imagination. The dynasty became increasingly inward-looking, focused on ritual, piety, and lineage rather than adaptation and reform. This insularity contributed to Spain's inability to respond effectively to the challenges of a changing world, including the rise of mercantile capitalism, Protestantism, and new military strategies. Even the architecture of the time tells a story of contradictions. The austere grandeur of El Escorial, built under Philip II, stands as a monument to both religious devotion and imperial pride. It was a palace, monastery, and mausoleum in one of physical manifestation of the Habsburg worldview where power, death, and divine order were intimately linked. Yet this very monumentality also suggests a rigidity, a world closing in on itself rather than opening to new possibilities. As we reflect on the Spanish Habsburgs beyond their so-called Golden Age, we are reminded that history is rarely simple. The same dynasty that brought glory and cultural flourishing also presided over decline and disillusionment. Their story is one of grandeur and decay, control and chaos, vision and blindness. It challenges us to reconsider the nature of power and the price of empire, not just in terms of territorial conquest or royal lineage, but in human lives, cultural tension, and lost opportunities. The Spanish Habsburgs were not just figures in oil paintings or names in treaties. They were real people, often trapped by the very institutions they ruled. Their courtiers plotted and dreamed, their soldiers bled across continents, and their citizens prayed for relief in times of famine and war. To examine their reign is to witness the intersection of myth and reality, to see how empires rise and fall not only through battles, but through everyday decisions, beliefs, and failures. Charles II, the final sovereign from the Spanish branch of the Hapsburg dynasty, was born into a world already showing signs of imperial strain. His arrival was not met with the same unshaken optimism that had accompanied earlier monarchs of the House of Hapsburg. From the moment of his birth, concerns were whispered through the richly adorned corridors of the royal palace. His physical appearance and fragile condition did not inspire confidence, and the shadows cast by generations of intermarriage within the Hapsburg family loomed heavily over his fate. In the absence of a capable and robust monarch, the future of the vast and powerful Spanish Empire appeared uncertain. As years passed, those initial concerns would solidify into a defining crisis of rule. The circumstances surrounding Charles's birth were already filled with political calculation. His parents, Mariana of Austria and Philip IV, were closely related. This was not unusual in Hapsburg politics, which valued dynastic purity more than genetic health. Sadly, the consequences of this isolated strategy became heartbreakingly clear in the fragile appearance of Charles. His body was described by witnesses as weak and deformed. His jaw was prominent and misaligned, a problem severe enough to impact his speech and ability to chew. He experienced various health issues throughout his life, including epilepsy, digestive problems, and what many have seen as cognitive delays. As a child, he was wrapped in the rituals and formality of royal life, but little was done to prepare him for effective leadership. Despite his fragile health, Charles ascended the throne as a young child following the death of his father. His mother, Mariana of Austria, took on the role of regent, ruling in his name during his minority. Her regency was marked by factionalism and manipulation at court. Power struggles among noble families and royal advisors were rampant, each attempting to assert influence over the young and incapacitated king. These early years set the tone for a reign in which Charles would be more a symbol than a sovereign. His presence on the throne provided the semblance of continuity, but real control often rested in the hands of others. As Charles grew older, the question of his ability to produce an heir became increasingly urgent. He married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, but neither union produced children. The first queen, Marie-Louise, was young and reportedly terrified of the physical state of her husband. Their marriage remained childless until her untimely death. Maria Anna, his second queen, was brought from a powerful German lineage in the hope of reviving the Hapsburg cause. But once again, the marriage remained barren. Gossip swirled around the court and across Europe. Was Charles impotent? Cursed? Captured? His inability to secure a direct heir became the central drama of his reign, and one that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of Hapsburg power in Spain. Court physicians and foreign diplomats speculated openly about the king's ailments. Reports described a man who drooled when he spoke, who could not walk properly, and whose mind was slow and often distracted. Nevertheless, Charles was not without moments of lucidity or dignity. He was known to show kindness and religious devotion, and despite his condition, he was not unaware of the immense responsibilities laid upon him. In his later years, he made efforts to resolve court rivalries and pursue reforms, but these efforts were too feeble and too late to reverse the empire's downward trajectory. The empire Charles inherited was one riddled with economic instability. The crown was heavily indebted from decades of war and mismanagement. Inflation, caused in part by the over-reliance on silver from the Americas, had eroded the wealth of the kingdom. Local economies in Castile and Aragon struggled under the weight of taxation and diminishing returns. Agriculture suffered from neglect, while manufacturing stagnated. The empire's bureaucratic machinery, once the envy of Europe, had become bloated and ineffective. Administrative posts were sold as a source of revenue, and corruption became embedded in the very structure of governance. Militarily, Spain had lost its edge. The famed Spanish infantry was no longer the terror of European battlefields. French forces, under the leadership of the Bourbon monarchy, began to assert dominance on the continent. Conflicts with France during Charles's reign drained Spain further, both financially and strategically. The 9 Years' War, fought between a coalition of European powers and France, placed Spain in a precarious position. While Spain formally aligned against France, its military contributions were inconsistent and often poorly coordinated. French ambitions under Louis XIV threatened to overshadow Spain's influence not only in Europe, but across its overseas territories as well. In Italy, the Netherlands, and parts of the Americas, Spain struggled to maintain control. The Dutch revolt had already cost Spain significant ground, and the ongoing pressure from England and France made the remaining overseas possessions increasingly difficult to defend. Trade routes were contested, colonial rebellions simmered, and the once seamless flow of goods and wealth across the Atlantic began to fracture. Charles presided over this slow disintegration with little power to stop it. Domestically, the Spanish general public grew restless. The peasantry suffered under heavy taxes and limited opportunities. The nobility, increasingly disconnected from the hardships of the people, indulged in courtly luxury and internal feuding. The clergy maintained its influence, often reinforcing the conservative forces that resisted reform. Efforts to modernize were sporadic and largely unsuccessful. The empire appeared trapped in a cycle of tradition and decline, unable to adapt to the changing political and economic realities of Europe. Charles's court became a battleground for competing factions. On one side were supporters of an Austrian successor, hoping to keep the Hapsburg line alive in Spain. On the other hand, supporters of a French candidate were typically favored by those who sought peace with France and a fresh start. Charles, increasingly aware of his impending death and the absence of an heir, was pressured constantly to name a successor. He wavered for years, surrounded by advisors with competing loyalties and self-interest. In the final months of his life, Charles's health deteriorated further. He suffered from seizures, swelling, and periods of unconsciousness. Foreign observers noted with increasing alarm the physical and mental decay of the king. Diplomats reported on his declining appearance, hollow-eyed, unable to digest food, and in constant pain. Religious processions and rituals were performed to invoke divine intervention. Holy relics were paraded before him. Exorcisms were even attempted in a desperate effort to rid the monarch of what many believed were supernatural afflictions. These efforts did nothing to change the course of events. At last, Charles made his decision. He named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor. This act, though intended to preserve peace, instead triggered one of the most devastating wars in European history. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted as rival powers contested the legitimacy and implications of a French Bourbon inheriting the Spanish crown. The possibility of a union between the French and Spanish thrones alarmed England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire, all of whom feared the rise of an uncontested superpower in Western Europe. Charles passed away not long after making his final will. His death marked the end of over a century and a half of Hapsburg rule in Spain. He left behind no heir, no clear path forward, and a fractured empire on the brink of collapse. But his reign, often remembered as one of helpless decline, also encapsulates a larger truth about the dangers of dynastic obsession and imperial overreach. His life and rule were not merely a personal tragedy, though they certainly were that. They also served as a mirror held up to an empire that had exhausted itself in pursuit of glory. Spain under Charles II was a nation caught between the weight of its past and the uncertainty of its future. It had once dominated the seas, colonized continents, and shaped the faith and politics of Europe. But by the time Charles donned the crown, that era was ending. Charles himself, for all his frailty, can be seen as a symbol of the costs of empire. He bore the weight of a genetic strategy that prioritized bloodline over vitality. He was raised not for leadership, but for the performance of kingship, surrounded by ceremony but isolated from real power. He was prayed for, pitted, and propped up, but rarely taken seriously. In a court obsessed with appearances and protocol, Charles was the embodiment of what happened when a dynasty forgot to nurture strength in favor of sanctity and tradition. Yet it would be unfair to cast Charles purely as a passive figure. In his later years, he did attempt to act with independence. He showed concern for his kingdom and tried to balance the competing interests around him. He questioned the motives of those who advised him, and he sought the well-being of Spain even when his body failed him. He chose a successor not out of personal favoritism, but from a genuine, if flawed, attempt to ensure stability. The reign of Charles II is one of deep contradictions. It is a story of decline, but not without dignity. It is a tale of decay, but also of resilience. His personal suffering was immense, yet his life touched the fate of millions. His decisions, however constrained, shaped the future of Europe. He is remembered as the last Hapsburg king of Spain, but he should also be remembered as a man who bore an impossible burden with quiet, tragic endurance. Charles did not lose an empire. That loss was the work of centuries of policies, wars, and decisions made long before he was born. What he inherited was a house already on fire. He lacked the strength to extinguish it, but he did not ignite the blaze. His reign invites us to look not only at the man, but at the system that produced him. It asks us to consider how power, when misused or misunderstood, can destroy the very institutions it seeks to protect. And it reminds us that behind every crown lies a human being, shaped by history and bound by fate. The story of the Spanish Inquisition remains one of the most disturbing and haunting chapters in the long and complex history of Spain, particularly during the era of the Hapsburg monarchy. Born out of a desire to solidify religious control and reinforce Catholic orthodoxy, the Inquisition cast a long shadow over Spanish society, shaping its culture, politics, and identity in ways that reverberated far beyond its borders. Though originally justified as a tool for spiritual purification and unity, the methods and consequences of the Inquisition reveal a much darker truth, a machinery of fear, repression, and suffering, orchestrated in the name of faith. The Spanish Inquisition did not emerge in a vacuum. Its roots can be traced to a time of transformation, when the Iberian Peninsula was undergoing profound changes. After centuries of conflict between Christian kingdoms and Islamic states during the Reconquista, Spain began to take shape as a unified Christian nation under the rule of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. With the fall of the last Muslim stronghold in Granada and the marriage that brought these two powerful monarchs together, Spain was positioned to become a dominant force in Europe. Religious unity was seen not just as a matter of belief, but as a matter of state policy, a necessary condition for national strength and divine favor. The Catholic monarchs believed that the integrity of their realm depended on the purity of its faith. Though they had conquered diverse peoples and inherited a society in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians had once coexisted with relative tolerance, this pluralism was now seen as a threat. Converts from Judaism and Islam, known as conversos and moriscos, were viewed with suspicion, accused of secretly practicing their former religions while outwardly claiming Christianity. In this climate of fear and mistrust, the Spanish Inquisition was born, a tribunal created not simply to root out heresy, but to enforce conformity and crush dissent. What distinguished the Spanish Inquisition from earlier efforts by the Church to combat heresy was its direct connection to the Spanish crown. While other inquisitions were generally under ecclesiastical control, the Spanish variant was established with royal authority and operated under the joint direction of the monarchy and the Church. This close collaboration made the Inquisition a tool of both religious and political power, allowing the crown to use spiritual authority as a means of control. Under the Hapsburgs, the Inquisition grew in scale and influence. It became a pillar of statecraft, used not only to enforce religious orthodoxy, but also to silence critics, manage political rivals, and maintain a rigid social order. As the Hapsburg monarchs expanded their dominions and wealth, they also deepened their commitment to Catholic identity. The Inquisition fit neatly into this agenda. It provided a means of reinforcing the idea that Spain was chosen by God to be the defender of the true faith, even as it expanded its empire across the Atlantic and into other parts of Europe. The methods employed by the Inquisition were chilling. Once accused, individuals were often arrested without warning, held in secret, and denied legal counsel. The accused had no right to know who had accused them or what evidence was being used. A person could languish for weeks, months, or even years in the cold, dark cells of the Inquisition's prisons, uncertain of their fate and isolated from the outside world. Torture was used routinely to extract confessions. The rationale was that heresy threatened not only individual souls, but the health of society itself. Therefore, extreme measures were justified in the effort to bring heretics back to the faith. Devices such as the rack, the strappado, and other cruel mechanisms inflicted unbearable pain, all under the guise of spiritual correction. Even if the victim survived the torture and confessed, the punishment did not end there. Public penance, humiliation, exile, and property confiscation were common. In more severe cases, the sentence was death by burning, carried out in the notorious public spectacles. These executions were not conducted in secrecy. On the contrary, they were staged events, designed to terrify and instruct the public. Crowds would gather to witness the final judgment, as the condemned, dressed in yellow robes marked with symbols of their supposed crimes, were paraded through the streets before being tied to stakes and set ablaze. Church and state leaders presided over these grim ceremonies, reinforcing the message that defiance of orthodoxy would not be tolerated. Among the primary targets of the Inquisition were Jews and Muslims, especially those who had converted to Christianity. The suspicion that these converts might secretly adhere to their old faiths led to constant surveillance and persecution. Entire families were torn apart by denunciations, often fueled by jealousy, rivalry, or greed. Accusations could come from neighbors, friends, or even family members. Once accused, the stain of heresy could cling to a person's descendants for generations, affecting marriage prospects, careers, and social standing. The Jewish community in Spain, once vibrant and integral to the intellectual and economic life of the kingdom, was systematically destroyed. Many Jews had already been expelled in the final decade of the 15th century, but those who remained or returned as conversos continued to face harassment and suspicion. Even the most devout Christian behavior could be interpreted as a mask for secret Judaic practices. The result was a culture of fear and distrust, in which personal expression, scholarship, and cultural diversity were stifled. Muslims, too, suffered under the Inquisition's harsh scrutiny. After the conquest of Granada, promises had been made to respect the traditions and rights of the Muslim population. But these promises were soon broken. Forced conversions were followed by increasing restrictions on dress, language, and customs. The Moriscos Muslims who had converted to Christianity were watched closely for signs of Islamic belief or practice. Uprisings and unrest led to brutal crackdowns and eventually to mass expulsions. The loss of the Morisco population, like that of the Jews, impoverished Spain culturally and economically. While the Inquisition is often associated primarily with the persecution of religious minorities, its reach extended further. Writers, philosophers, and scientists who explored ideas considered unorthodox were silenced or censored. Books were banned or burned. The Index of Prohibited Books served as a guide to forbidden knowledge, and possession of such texts could result in arrest. This intellectual suppression stunted the development of a more open and progressive society. Spain, which had once been home to a flourishing tradition of learning and exchange, became increasingly isolated from the currents of the European Enlightenment. Criticism of the Inquisition did exist, though it had to be carefully expressed. Some clerics and scholars argued against the brutality of its methods or questioned its theological justifications. But such voices were rare and often silenced. The fear of being accused oneself kept most dissenters quiet. The myth of absolute religious unity, upheld by force and fear, continued to dominate public life. Despite its terrible power, the Inquisition was not all-powerful. Its excesses provoked resentment and opposition in some quarters, especially among foreign observers. Travelers from other parts of Europe were shocked by what they witnessed and wrote accounts that contributed to the Black Legend, a view of Spain as uniquely cruel, fanatical, and backward. While some of this reputation was exaggerated for political purposes, there is no doubt that the Inquisition did real and lasting damage to Spain's international image and internal development. As the centuries passed, the Inquisition's influence began to wane. Changing political currents, shifts in religious thought, and the pressures of modernization made its methods increasingly untenable. By the end of the Hapsburg period, the Inquisition was losing its grip. Eventually, it was formally abolished in the 19th century, long after it had ceased to be the terror it once was. But its legacy endured, not only in historical memory, but in the scars it left on Spain's cultural and spiritual landscape. The question of the Inquisition's legacy remains a topic of debate. Some argue that it delayed the development of a modern, pluralistic society in Spain. By crushing dissent and enforcing rigid conformity, the Inquisition may have undermined creativity, innovation, and dialogue. Others suggest that its significance has been exaggerated, and that Spain's cultural achievements during the Golden Age demonstrate a society still capable of greatness despite repression. Some defend the Inquisition as a product of its time, arguing that it reflected the values and fears of a society striving for unity in the face of internal division and external threat. But even within that historical context, the cruelty and injustice of its methods are difficult to reconcile with the ideals it claimed to uphold. The Inquisition was not merely a spiritual tribunal, it was a political weapon, a tool of fear, and a force of exclusion. In contemporary Spain, the legacy of the Inquisition continues to shape how the nation grapples with its past. Efforts to remember and confront this history are seen in museums, literature, film, and public discourse. There is a growing recognition of the need to honor the victims and to understand the forces that allowed such cruelty to flourish under the guise of righteousness. The Inquisition serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, ideological extremism, and the persecution of those who are different. The Spanish Inquisition was born of a vision for a united and devout nation, but in its execution, it created division, suffering, and silence. It sought to purify, but it polluted. It aimed to enlighten, but it extinguished. It claimed to defend truth, but it feared inquiry. In this contradiction lies its tragedy and its enduring relevance. The Hapsburgs presided over a time of grandeur and ambition, but also over a nation haunted by suspicion and pain. The Inquisition was both a reflection of their power and a symptom of their fear. As Spain moved forward into modernity, the shadows cast by the Inquisition remained long and deep. The era often referred to as the Golden Age of Spain, marked by the rule of the Hapsburg monarchy, is typically celebrated as a time of immense artistic brilliance, global exploration, and imperial power. Grand names such as Cervantes, Velázquez, and El Greco are etched into the collective memory of world culture, and the successes of conquistadors and navigators dominate the popular imagination. Yet beneath this shimmering surface lies a more nuanced and often somber reality. The splendor of palaces and the riches flowing from across the oceans came at a cost often borne by the voiceless, the common people of Spain, the enslaved, the colonized, and those living in the shadows of history. Their stories, while less documented, form the bedrock of the era's complex legacy and reveal a golden age whose luster did not touch every life equally. Under the Hapsburg rule, Spain transformed into one of the most powerful empires in the world, with territories stretching across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia. The wealth generated from these vast holdings fueled monumental artistic and scientific endeavors. Patronage from the royal court and the church allowed painters, poets, architects, and scholars to flourish. While these achievements are rightly acknowledged and admired, they often obscure the daily struggles of the broader population: farmers, laborers, artisans, women, religious minorities, and the colonized peoples of the New World. For the majority of people living within the Spanish Empire, life was not gilded in gold. In the cities and countryside of the Iberian Peninsula, poverty, hunger, and disease were constant companions. Social mobility was rare, and the rigid class structure imposed significant limits on personal agency. The nobility and clergy enjoyed privileges and protections, while the peasantry and urban poor bore the brunt of taxation and military conscription. Rural communities were deeply affected by the policies of landowners and the crown, which often prioritized profit and production over the welfare of the people. Peasants labored under harsh conditions, bound to the land by economic dependence and traditional hierarchies. Famine and plague swept through regions, and periods of poor harvests brought suffering that was largely invisible to the elite. Women, especially those in lower classes, faced double burdens. Not only did they work the land or in domestic roles, but they also contended with limited rights, social expectations, and systemic vulnerability. Widows and single mothers struggled to survive in a world that offered them few protections, and their contributions, both economic and cultural, went largely unrecognized. In urban centers such as Seville and Madrid, inequality was just as stark. As trade and wealth flowed in from the Americas, so too did rising costs of living and inflation, disproportionately affecting working-class citizens. Craftspeople, merchants, and day laborers navigated a complex economy that was often hostile to their survival. The guild system, while offering some structure and support, also imposed restrictions that limited innovation and personal advancement. Religious festivals, local markets, and neighborhood networks provided occasional respite and solidarity, but life remained precarious for many. Spain's marginalized communities endured even harsher conditions. The forced conversions of Jews and Muslims, coupled with the constant threat of persecution under the Inquisition, created a climate of fear and secrecy. Conversos and Moriscos, Jews and Muslims, who had ostensibly converted to Christianity, lived under the shadow of suspicion. Their social and economic contributions were often substantial, but their presence was never fully accepted. Many were artisans, doctors, scholars, and traders who enriched Spanish society with their knowledge and skills, yet they remained outsiders, vulnerable to denunciation and violence. Women in these communities faced unique struggles. Often caught between two cultural identities, they navigated a treacherous social landscape where loyalty and piety were constantly questioned. The pressures to conform, marry strategically, and avoid drawing attention were immense. Their stories rarely appear in official chronicles, yet they carried traditions, preserved language, and raised children under conditions of unimaginable stress and uncertainty. Beyond the borders of the Iberian Peninsula, the impact of Hapsburg rule was even more profound and devastating. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, fueled by both ambition and religious zeal, led to the dismantling of entire civilizations. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, Aztec, Inca, Maya, and countless smaller societies faced conquest, enslavement, forced conversion, and cultural erasure. While gold and silver poured into Spanish coffers, entire populations were decimated by war, enslavement, and disease. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers control over local indigenous labor and tribute, functioned as a form of feudal exploitation. In theory, the system required encomiendas to provide for the spiritual and material well-being of the native populations under their care. In practice, it led to widespread abuse, forced labor, and suffering. Indigenous people were compelled to mine silver, work on plantations, and serve their colonial masters in conditions of near slavery. Those who resisted faced brutal punishment. Entire villages were uprooted and relocated, traditional governance structures dismantled, and ancient customs suppressed. Despite these hardships, indigenous communities showed remarkable resilience. They adapted, resisted, and preserved elements of their cultures, often blending them with imposed Christian traditions in a process of syncretism. Stories, languages, and rituals survived through oral transmission and clandestine practices. Women played a crucial role in this cultural survival, maintaining family structures, preserving knowledge, and shaping new hybrid identities in the face of overwhelming pressure. In the colonial context, African slaves also became a critical part of the Spanish imperial economy, particularly in regions such as the Caribbean and the coastal areas of South America. Brought across the Atlantic under horrific conditions, enslaved Africans labored in sugar plantations, mines, and households, enduring unimaginable suffering. Their cultural imprint, though often erased or ignored in traditional accounts, is undeniable. Music, food, language, and religious practices brought from Africa enriched the cultures of the Americas, creating vibrant traditions that endure to this day. Even in the heart of Spain, the consequences of imperialism were felt in complex and often contradictory ways. The influx of wealth created both opportunity and instability. While elites grew richer and invested in art and architecture, much of the population struggled with rising prices and stagnating wages. The military campaigns required to maintain and expand the empire drained the treasury and took a heavy toll on the population. Young men were conscripted to fight in wars that had little to do with their own lives, while their families coped with absence and loss. Cultural narratives, shaped by court historians and sanctioned intellectuals, emphasized Spain's divine mission and its status as a global superpower. These narratives left little room for the voices of dissent or for those whose lives contradicted the vision of national greatness. Poets and playwrights who dared to question authority or portray social inequality risked censorship and reprisal. Nonetheless, some found ways to express critique and complexity, embedding social commentary in allegory and symbolism. One cannot examine this era without acknowledging the contributions of ordinary people to the very achievements that defined the Golden Age. The construction of grand cathedrals, the production of fine textiles, the cultivation of crops, and the creation of everyday goods were all the work of laborers, artisans, and peasants. While their names are largely lost to history, their hands built the foundations of a society that claimed glory on the world stage. Education and literacy remained out of reach for most, but oral tradition, religious instruction, and community gatherings provided spaces where knowledge was shared and preserved. Midwives, herbalists, storytellers, and local leaders played crucial roles in their communities, passing down wisdom that often went unrecognized by official authorities. These individuals ensured the continuity of cultural life amid the pressures of conformity and control. The lives of the poor, the colonized, and the marginalized during the Hapsburg era do not fit neatly into the triumphant narrative of a golden age. Their experiences challenge us to reconsider what it means for an age to be golden. If the period brought monumental art and discovery, it also brought suffering, exclusion, and violence. To fully understand the legacy of the Hapsburgs, we must see beyond the gilded frame and into the lives of those who supported, resisted, and endured their rule. The complexity of the period lies in its contradictions. It was an age of brilliance and brutality, of faith and fanaticism, of beauty and bloodshed. In examining the hidden legacies of this time, we uncover a richer, more human story, one that honors not only the celebrated, but also the silenced. From the streets of Toledo to the jungles of the Amazon, from the palaces of Madrid to the kitchens and fields of distant colonies, people lived, struggled, and contributed in ways that demand recognition. The voices of the oppressed, though often muted in official history, continue to resonate through surviving documents, oral histories, and cultural memory. Their endurance invites us to reflect on the costs of empire and the resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that history is not only made by kings and generals, but also by the millions whose names never appear in the annals of power. The legacy of the Hapsburgs in Spain weaves together threads of grandeur, power, complexity, and contradiction. To speak of the Hapsburgs is to delve into one of the most influential dynasties in European history, whose reach extended across continents and whose decisions echoed through centuries. Their imprint on Spain is visible not only in the monuments and masterpieces that still adorn the landscape, but also in the cultural psyche, religious traditions, and political structures that endured long after their direct rule had ended. The Hapsburg story in Spain is not one of simple rise and fall, but of a multifaceted influence that continues to provoke admiration, debate, and inquiry to this day. The Hapsburg dynasty rose to prominence through a calculated mixture of diplomacy, marriage, and war. Their ascension to the Spanish throne marked the beginning of a union between diverse realms, which included the Iberian Peninsula, large parts of Europe, and the expanding colonies in the New World. This vast empire demanded careful governance, and the Hapsburgs developed an intricate system of alliances, bureaucracies, and religious institutions to maintain order and legitimacy. Yet behind the regal portraits and solemn ceremonies lay a family marked by internal rivalries, dynastic concerns, and an obsessive commitment to preserving their bloodline and divine right to rule. From the earliest moments of their rule, the Spanish Habsburgs positioned themselves not only as political leaders, but as defenders of the Catholic faith. This fusion of crown and church would define much of their policy and cultural impact. Religious conformity became both a moral imperative and a tool of governance. Cathedrals, monasteries, and religious artworks flourished under their patronage. Architects and artists were employed to express the spiritual and temporal power of the monarchy. The Escorial, a monumental royal complex near Madrid, stands as a testament to this union of the sacred and the sovereign. Its austere elegance and symbolic design reflect the Habsburgs' commitment to discipline, devotion, and dynastic permanence. The arts thrived under the Habsburgs, but always under the shadow of their ideology. Painters like Velázquez, Murillo, and El Greco produced some of the most iconic works of the era. Their art was not only aesthetic, but political, depicting the grandeur of the monarchy, the sanctity of the church, and the nobility of Spanish ideals. These images helped construct a national identity rooted in Catholicism, monarchy, and a sense of divine mission. Literature followed a similar path. Writers like Cervantes pushed boundaries, even as they navigated the restrictions of censorship and orthodoxy. The literature of the period reveals a society grappling with its contradictions: wealth and poverty, power and decay, belief and disillusionment. The Habsburg commitment to Catholic orthodoxy had far-reaching consequences. It intensified the power of the Inquisition, suppressed dissent, and marginalized minority communities. It also shaped Spain's engagement with the wider world. The conquest and colonization of the Americas were driven not only by the pursuit of wealth, but by the desire to spread the Catholic faith. Missionaries accompanied conquistadors, Churches were built beside military outposts, and native belief systems were often crushed in the name of salvation. This religious fervor, while central to the Hapsburg identity, also contributed to a rigidness that would eventually stifle intellectual and economic growth in comparison to other emerging powers. Dynastic concerns were never far from the minds of Hapsburg rulers. The careful orchestration of marriages served both political strategy and genetic continuity. The desire to maintain a pure royal lineage, however, came with a steep price. Generations of intermarriage among European royal families led to a narrowing of the gene pool, culminating in physical and mental disabilities in later monarchs. This dynastic obsession reached its tragic climax in the figure of Charles II, whose troubled reign signaled the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. His inability to produce an heir triggered a succession crisis that plunged Europe into conflict and marked the close of an era. Yet even as the Habsburg line in Spain came to an end, their influence did not vanish. Their administrative reforms, legal codes, and territorial arrangements left enduring marks on the regions they ruled. The legacy of centralized authority, close alliance with the Church, and complex bureaucratic systems shaped Spain's governance long after its dynasty was replaced by the Bourbons. Cultural institutions founded or expanded under their rule continued to operate, and their architectural commissions still define many Spanish cities. The legacy of the Hapsburgs is also deeply embedded in Spanish identity. National narratives continue to wrestle with the meaning of their reign. Were the Habsburgs visionaries who brought Spain to the pinnacle of global power, or were they architects of decline who clung too tightly to outdated ideals? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. They presided over both Spain's greatest expansion and its early signs of collapse. Their reign was marked by extraordinary beauty and extraordinary cruelty, by high ideals and harsh. In the modern world, the Habsburgs continue to fascinate scholars, artists, and the public alike. Their portraits, letters, and palaces are studied not just for their historical value, but for what they reveal about human nature, governance, and the intersection of faith and power. Documentaries, novels, and academic debates revisit their reign from new angles, exploring the nuances of their policies and the lives of those who lived under their rule. Their story raises timeless questions about leadership, legacy, and the costs of empire. There is also a growing recognition of the voices that were excluded from the official Habsburg narrative. Historians and writers are now paying closer attention to the lives of women in the royal court, the experiences of indigenous peoples under Spanish colonization, and the contributions of religious minorities and commoners to the Habsburg legacy. These perspectives enrich our understanding of the past, challenging us to look beyond kings and conquests to the broader human story. The Habsburg dynasty also left its mark on the architecture and urban planning of Spain and its former colonies. Royal palaces, government buildings, and churches constructed during their reign reflect a mixture of Renaissance, Gothic, and Baroque styles. These structures were not only meant to house or serve, they were symbols of authority, stability, and divine order. The design of public spaces and the layout of colonial cities often mirrored the hierarchical worldview of their creators, reinforcing social divisions and centralizing control. Education and intellectual life during the Habsburg era were also shaped by the monarchy's priorities. Universities and seminaries flourished, often under the supervision of religious orders. While these institutions preserved classical knowledge and trained administrators for the empire, they also reinforced orthodoxy and resisted reform. Nevertheless, scientific and philosophical ideas found ways to circulate, sometimes through informal networks or under the guise of religious commentary. The tension between control and curiosity defined the intellectual climate of the time. In the realm of law and governance, the Habsburgs left behind a complex legacy. They expanded royal authority while simultaneously relying on regional elites and councils to manage their vast empire. This created a system that was both centralized and fragmented, efficient in some areas and paralyzed in others. The balance of power between the crown and local institutions would continue to evolve long after the Habsburgs, but their model of rule set important precedents. Their use of legal frameworks to justify conquest, taxation, and religious control also laid the groundwork for later colonial and national policies. One of the most enduring aspects of the Habsburg legacy is their symbolic power. Their image as protectors of the faith, rulers of a vast empire, and bearers of divine authority continues to captivate the imagination. This symbolism has been used in various ways over the centuries. As a rallying point for conservative movements, a subject for artistic exploration, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of power unchecked by adaptation. The Hapsburg myth, like their history, is layered with contradictions, inviting both reverence and critique. In family terms, the Hapsburgs created a vast web of alliances across Europe. Their bloodline linked courts from Vienna to Madrid, from Prague to Naples. These connections allowed them to shape the politics of the continent, often using marriage as a tool of diplomacy and domination. But this same strategy also contributed to their eventual decline, as it prioritized dynastic purity over broader adaptability. The infamous Hapsburg jaw, a physical manifestation of centuries of intermarriage, became a symbol of the dangers of insularity and excessive pride. In literature and folklore, the Hapsburgs appear as tragic figures, noble rulers, and sometimes as comic caricatures. Their story is told and retold in plays, novels, and popular history books. Their reign provides a backdrop for exploring themes of ambition, loyalty, faith, and failure. Characters inspired by Hapsburg monarchs populate works of fiction that span genres and generations, reflecting the enduring relevance of their story. Even in contemporary Spain and other parts of Europe, the memory of the Hapsburgs remains a topic of public interest and debate. Commemorations, museum exhibits, and academic conferences revisit their reign, not only to celebrate their contributions, but to interrogate the darker aspects of their legacy. The rise of interest in imperial history, colonial studies, and global networks has further deepened the exploration of the Hapsburg impact. Scholars now examine how their policies influenced everything from trade routes and migration patterns to legal systems and religious institutions. The Hapsburgs also remind us of the fragility of power. Despite their wealth, prestige, and divine claims, they were not immune to the forces of change, dissent, and decay. Their empire, like all empires, was subject to the tides of history. Economic crises, military defeats, internal divisions, and shifting cultural values eventually eroded the foundations they had built. Their decline was not abrupt, but gradual, a long unraveling of a grand vision that had once seemed unassailable. Yet decline did not erase their influence. The cultural and institutional structures they created endured, evolving with time but retaining traces of their origin. In the modern Spanish state, echoes of Hapsburg administration, legal traditions, and ceremonial customs can still be felt. In former colonies, the architectural, linguistic, and religious legacies of their rule remain visible and contested. The Hapsburgs, though no longer a ruling family, remain part of the living history of many nations. To speak of the Hapsburg legacy is to engage with a rich and challenging past. It is to confront the complexities of empire, the allure of power, and the cost of ambition. It is to recognize the beauty they inspired and the suffering they caused, the unity they sought and the divisions they enforced. It is to see history not as a linear tale of progress or decline, but as a tapestry intricate, interwoven, and ever open to reinterpretation. The Spanish Habsburgs, with their opulent courts, vast empire, and tragic decline, remain one of the most captivating dynasties in European history. Centuries after their rule ended, the fascination with their lives, decisions, and legacy continues to grow. Their presence lingers not only in the dusty halls of academic institutions, but also in the living worlds of literature, film, television, and art. It is not only historians who find themselves drawn to their story. Writers, directors, and audiences across the world are continually reimagining the lives of Hapsburg monarchs, noble families, clerics, and ordinary subjects who lived beneath their powerful and intricate rule. The dynasty's compelling blend of political power, religious fervor, internal drama, and cultural richness lends itself to endless interpretation, making the Hapsburgs a fixture in both scholarly inquiry and popular imagination. Part of what makes the Hapsburgs so enduring in the public mind is their dramatic trajectory, a rise to global dominance followed by a slow and painful decline. This pattern fits the timeless archetype of imperial narratives, mirroring stories that stretch back to classical antiquity. Audiences are instinctively drawn to tales of greatness tinged with tragedy. The Habsburgs' imperial expanse, their elaborate rituals, and their commitment to Catholic orthodoxy all contributed to a mystique that still invites awe. At the same time, the human vulnerabilities beneath the gilded crowns, the illnesses, infertility, political miscalculations, and isolation bring their story closer to modern sensibilities. They are not simply figures frozen in oil paintings. They are people whose lives raise questions about duty, legacy, and the cost of absolute power. In literature, the Hapsburg era has long been a source of inspiration. Historical novels often use their reign as a backdrop to explore personal and political tensions. Whether focusing on a royal court intrigue, a mystic nun's visions, or the quiet despair of a court artist, writers return again and again to the contradictions of the Hapsburg world. The characters are vivid: a melancholy king surrounded by scheming advisors, a queen torn between devotion and despair, a peasant laboring beneath the weight of empire. These stories illuminate a time that feels distant yet emotionally immediate, resonating with contemporary readers through universal themes of ambition, loyalty, faith, and loss. Modern authors also tend to focus on the silenced voices of the period: women, minorities, indigenous people, and dissenters who lived under Hapsburg rule but rarely appear in official chronicles. These perspectives add new layers of meaning to our understanding of the dynasty, expanding the narrative beyond courtly life and statecraft. A fictionalized account of a Muslim convert navigating suspicion and exile under the Inquisition, or a novel about a mixed-race child born in the Americas under colonial rule, reveals how deeply the Hapsburgs shaped the lives of millions. These creative works do not merely retell history, they reinterpret it, giving voice to those who were once voiceless. Film and television have also played a central role in reviving interest in the Hapsburgs. Period dramas often draw from their lavish settings, complex political maneuvers, and intense personal tragedies. The visual opulence of the Spanish court, the flowing robes, dark wood furniture, golden candlesticks, and crucifixes creates a rich atmosphere that evokes both reverence and unease. Directors are often fascinated by the symbolic weight of Hapsburg imagery. A monarch praying alone in a cathedral, a cloistered queen whispering secrets, a portrait being painted while war brews in the background. These scenes dramatize not only history but emotion, power, and the tensions of a world teetering between sacred ideals and worldly ambitions. Even in more fantastical or allegorical works, echoes of the Hapsburgs are easy to spot. The archetype of the doomed monarch, isolated, devout, and burdened by legacy, often owes much to the real-life figures who wore the Spanish crown. The stories of rulers like Charles II, with his fragile body and uncertain mind, have influenced portrayals of haunted kings and crumbling dynasties in various genres. The Hapsburgs serve as a model for understanding how personal suffering and public responsibility can tragically intertwine. Beyond fiction, the Hapsburg legacy has found renewed attention in historical documentaries, museum exhibitions, podcasts, and academic publications. These modern interpretations often reflect changing societal values. Where past historians may have emphasized military achievements or religious unity, today's scholars are more likely to explore questions of social justice, identity, and pluralism. The rigid hierarchy and religious conformity of the Hapsburg world are now viewed with more critical distance, encouraging audiences to consider not only what was built during their reign, but what was silenced or destroyed. The Catholicism of the Hapsburgs, once celebrated as a foundation of unity, is now examined for its role in supporting intolerance and suppressing dissent. The empire's expansion is reconsidered in the context of colonial violence, forced conversions, and cultural erasure. Yet this critical lens does not necessarily diminish the fascination with the Hapsburgs. On the contrary, it makes them more relevant. They become not just historical figures, but mirrors reflecting our own evolving attitudes toward faith, power, and inclusion. In Spain and across Europe, the memory of the Hapsburgs has become part of cultural identity, tourist narratives, and public history. Cities like Madrid, Vienna, and Brussels still carry architectural and symbolic traces of the dynasty's presence. Guided tours through royal palaces and cathedrals present the grandeur of Hapsburg rule, while also acknowledging the darker elements of their reign. Museum collections display not only paintings and jewels, but also instruments of the Inquisition, colonial artifacts, and the everyday objects of the subjects they governed. These juxtapositions invite reflection on the contradictions of empire and the responsibilities of remembrance. In education, the Hapsburgs continue to serve as a case study for discussions about monarchy, governance, and international relations. Their vast and unwieldy empire presents lessons in diplomacy, administration, and the dangers of overextension. Their efforts to manage religious diversity through suppression rather than inclusion are often cited in debates about tolerance and human rights. Their reliance on dynastic marriage and bloodlines opens conversations about genetics, disability, and the personal cost of political calculation. Students are encouraged not only to learn about the Hapsburgs, but to learn from them. Art historians, too, find the Hapsburg era rich with material. The interplay between political power and artistic expression under their rule continues to inspire new interpretations. How did royal patronage influence the themes and styles of the painters they supported? How did religious iconography serve to reinforce authority and social norms? What can the portrayal of bodies, clothing, and gestures in court portraits tell us about the unspoken rules of the time? These questions fuel an ongoing dialogue between past and present, aesthetics and ideology. Genealogy and popular science have also played a role in reviving interest in the Hapsburgs. Studies of royal bloodlines and genetic disorders have shed light on the consequences of their marriage practices. The famously prominent jaw and other inherited traits of the family are not just curiosities, they are tangible reminders of how political strategy can shape biology. Discussions about these topics often spill into public discourse, where they are met with a mix of fascination, pity, and dark humor. In this way, the Hapsburgs continue to provoke complex emotional responses, bridging the gap between science and story. The digital age has also transformed how the Hapsburgs are remembered and discussed. Online archives, virtual museum tours, and social media platforms allow people around the world to engage with their legacy. Whether it is a thread dissecting the symbolism in a royal painting, a podcast episode about a lesser-known Hapsburg ruler, or a meme highlighting the tragic absurdity of court politics, the dynasty's presence online is both educational and playful. This accessibility helps demystify the past while preserving its depth, making history not only something to study, but something to experience and share. The Hapsburgs continue to capture imaginations because they stand at the intersection of so many themes that remain vital today. Their rule touches on questions of leadership, identity, religion, diversity, justice, and memory. Their lives illustrate the tension between the individual and the institution, between the private and the public, between ideals and actions. Their world was one of splendor and suffering, innovation and repression, glory and grief. In understanding them, we begin to understand more about ourselves and the world we have inherited. Perhaps most importantly, the story of the Hapsburgs resists closure. Their legacy cannot be neatly summarized or easily classified. It evolves as new evidence is uncovered, as perspectives shift, and as the questions we ask about history continue to change. The end of their dynasty was not the end of their influence. They remain with us in architecture and art, in myth and memory, in cautionary tales and inspiring stories. Their ghosts walk through museums and classrooms, novels and films, conversations and controversies. As interest in the Spanish Habsburgs continues to grow, so too does the need for deeper exploration. There are still hidden stories waiting to be uncovered, forgotten voices that deserve to be heard, and connections between past and present that can illuminate the future. To understand the Hapsburgs is not just to learn about monarchs and empires. It is to reflect on the human condition, its strengths, its failures, its contradictions, and its dreams. Reflecting on the legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs means stepping into a world of grandeur, complexity, contradiction, and enduring influence. Their reign left deep impressions not only on the political landscape of Europe, but also on culture, religion, science, society, and the collective memory of nations. It was an era filled with splendor and suffering, a time when the strength of a powerful empire walked hand in hand with the weight of deeply rooted problems. To understand the Hapsburgs is not merely to examine the choices of monarchs and nobles, it is to explore the intricate web of decisions, ideologies, hopes, and failures that shaped an age and still echo in the present. The Hapsburgs did not rule in isolation. Their empire was not confined to the royal palaces of Madrid or the battlefields of Europe. It stretched across oceans, over mountains, through colonial settlements, and deep into the daily lives of countless individuals, from monarchs and cardinals to peasants, artists, scholars, soldiers, and slaves. They built churches and courts, financed artists and inquisitions, supported exploration and conquest, imposed religious orthodoxy, and struggled with an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. Yet behind these grand structures and bold policies was a fragile system, one often held together by inherited power, divine justification, and sometimes sheer force of will. What endures about the Spanish Habsburgs is not simply the fact that they reigned over a great empire. It is the complexity of their story. Their age was marked by artistic brilliance and scientific curiosity, but also by religious intolerance and economic strain. The wealth pouring in from colonies supported cultural masterpieces, but masked the crumbling foundation of a failing economy. The unity they pursued through Catholic orthodoxy led to the expulsion and persecution of Jews and Muslims, weakening the diversity and productivity of the very society they aimed to strengthen. Their obsession with lineage and purity of blood ensured dynastic continuity for a time, but ultimately sowed the seeds of physical and political decline. The contradictions of the Hapsburg era are not anomalies. They are central to understanding its meaning. That duality, the light and the shadow, is what makes the period so rich for reflection and study. Spain under the Hapsburgs was a land of grand vision and harsh realities, of flourishing creativity and silenced dissent. It was a place where architecture and power reinforced one another, where royal courts dazzled while fields lay barren, and where the past was constantly invoked to secure the present. Today, the legacy of the Hapsburgs is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It offers a lens through which to view our modern world, particularly the lingering effects of imperial ambition, centralized power, and cultural domination. The institutions they built, the ideologies they promoted, and the conflicts they initiated continue to influence how societies understand governance, religion, diversity, and identity. In the Americas, their colonial policies laid the groundwork for social structures that are still being reckoned with. In Europe, their dynastic maneuvering contributed to the shaping of modern nation-states. In the arts and sciences, their patronage helped preserve a legacy of cultural brilliance that remains foundational. What stands out most from studying the Hapsburgs is how much their story demands nuance. They cannot be easily classified as heroes or villains, visionaries or tyrants. Their policies were both progressive and repressive. Their motivations were often a mix of faith, ambition, fear, and duty. Even within their own family, there was conflict between reformers and conservatives, between rulers and consorts, between public obligation and private suffering. The challenge for anyone seeking to understand their legacy is to hold all these truths together, to avoid simplification, and to embrace the full spectrum of their impact. That is why engaging with the Hapsburg story requires more than just reading dates and facts. It invites critical thought, empathy, curiosity, and imagination. It calls for us to question how power is gained and maintained, how belief can inspire both beauty and brutality, and how empires rise and fall not only through battles and treaties, but through the everyday choices of individuals. For those inspired by the intricate history of the Spanish Habsburgs, there are countless ways to explore further. Museums across Spain and Europe house treasures from the Habsburg-era paintings, manuscripts, artifacts, and architectural wonders that speak to the aesthetics and values of the time. A walk through the Royal Palace of Madrid or the Escorial Monastery offers more than just a visual experience. It provides insight into how power presented itself, how rulers shaped space to reflect ideology, and how memory was preserved and curated for future generations. Historical documentaries and scholarly texts delve into the lesser-known aspects of the Habsburg world economic struggles, the impact of the Inquisition, the role of women in court, or the life of subjects under colonial rule. Many universities and cultural institutions offer lectures, seminars, and courses that explore the era through new perspectives. These opportunities not only deepen knowledge, but help reframe old narratives through the lenses of modern thought. There is also much to be gained by participating in conversations with others interested in this period. Book clubs, discussion groups, online forums, and community events centered around history and culture provide a platform for shared learning and interpretation. The story of the Hapsburgs is not static. It evolves with every question we ask, every new source we examine, and every perspective we include. The more voices we invite into the conversation, the richer our understanding becomes. Reflecting on the Spanish Habsburgs is an invitation to think more deeply about the forces that shape societies, how belief systems influence behavior, how power structures endure or collapse, and how history continues to inform identity. Their story reminds us that the past is never truly past. It lives on in the buildings we walk through, the traditions we uphold, the art we admire, and the questions we continue to ask. It challenges us to see beyond the surface, to look into the shadows as well as the light, and to find meaning not only in triumphs but also in tragedies. As this exploration draws to a close, the Real journey begins with the viewer, the reader, the student, the curious mind willing to continue asking, learning, and sharing. Whether by visiting a historical site, reading a biography, watching a documentary, or simply starting a conversation, each step brings us closer to understanding not only the Hapsburgs but ourselves. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It is a living dialogue between then and now, between power and people, between memory and imagination. So let this be an invitation not just to remember the Spanish Habsburgs, but to engage with their story in ways that are thoughtful, creative, and meaningful. The complexity of their era offers more than facts to memorize. It offers insights, challenges, and opportunities to reflect on the human condition across time. By exploring the Hapsburgs, we begin to see how history is not just something we inherit, but something we actively interpret and pass on. And in doing so, we ensure that their legacy continues to provoke thought, stir emotion, and inspire deeper inquiry for generations to come.